Mary Simon called her appointment as Canada's first Indigenous Governor-General a watershed moment for reconciliation, which for her is a way of life needing daily attention.
Our society must recognize together our moments of regret alongside those that give us pride, because it creates space for healing, acceptance, and the rebuilding of trust.
That rebuilding has taken on even greater significance with the wave of new evidence emerging of the horrendous legacy of residential schools. Hundreds upon hundreds of potential unmarked child graves already detected, with countless more likely to come at sites across the country, including in Kamloops, where survivors offered harrowing, poignant words of abuse, lost identities, and lost siblings.
So when they got there, they told my mom and dad that she had gotten sick and died. She was 13. And they wanted to know why wasn't she taken to a doctor, to the hospital. It was right across the bridge. And there were no answers.
Calls have continued for a full papal apology and access to church records, and for more resources to properly search for remains. The Trudeau government pledged $321 million in early August. The TRC's 94 calls to action touched on culture and health, language and justice, child welfare and education. But more than half dealt with reconciliation, including missing children and residential school burial sites. The first woman to serve as AFN National Chief wants full implementation of those calls to action and swift movement on systemic racism, climate change, and economic growth. Roseanne Archibald pledging a respectful but firm relationship with the federal government.
I'm holding two spaces within me. I'm not just one, hi, I'm going to be your friend all the time. That's not me. And I know that with that heart-centered approach, together with any government, we can move the yardstick. We can create quantum leaps of change.
The reckoning over unmarked graves led federal leaders to renew their commitment to reconciliation.
Saying sorry for the tragedies of the past is not enough. It is not enough for the children who died, for the families, or for the survivors and communities. Only with our actions can we choose a better path, and that is what our government will always try to do.
We need concrete action. What does that look like? Stop the legal battles. Stop fighting Indigenous kids in court. Stop fighting against Human Rights Tribunal decisions. Stop fighting survivors of residential schools in court.
Reconciliation requires more than important but only symbolic gestures. It requires action. It requires restoring trust in the federal government and its institutions.
But even before the news on unmarked graves, the reconciliation effort had been strained repeatedly since the last election. Blockades and protests across Canada in support of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their pipeline opposition. Tension in Nova Scotia over the lobster fishery and Mi'kmaq treaty rights. And more tragedies that sparked calls to address systemic racism. From the RCMP's fatal shooting of Chantel Moore in New Brunswick to the death of Joyce Echaquan in a Quebec hospital. And then there was COVID-19. Outbreaks led to military deployments to many remote communities, and at one point the infection rate was 40% higher for on-reserve First Nations compared to the overall population. Indigenous people reported more stress, more mental health concerns, and a more severe impact on their finances and on their access to essential items. Lockdowns also magnified long-standing concerns about clean water, overcrowded and substandard housing, and access to high-speed internet.
You start to go, well, wait a second, how do you access services? How do you access healthcare? How do you physically distance or quarantine people when you have not enough space to live in or houses for people to be in? And clean drinking water or clean water altogether so that you can wash your hands like they're asking you to do with public health messaging.
But as leaders again talk of reconciliation during the campaign, It's worth noting 2 Indigenous women that will not be among those vying for re-election, leaving instead scathing criticism of their place in Parliament. Former Liberal Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould decried a toxic environment marginalizing individuals from certain backgrounds despite shattering revelations about our history and the urgent need for true justice and reconciliation. And 27-year-old Mumilak Kakak, elected 2 years ago in Nunavut, said she is already tired of hearing nice, pretty words that to her remain just words.
On one side, we have a mountain of suffering, and whenever the government gives us a grain of sand of support, they seem to think the trauma from our past has been rectified, that somehow they deserve a pat on the back. But it will take a mountain of support to even begin the healing process. As long as these halls echo with empty promises instead of real action, I will not belong here.